And as mentioned, President Trump is ordering Special Envoy Steve Witkoff to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin. It comes as the U.S. is gaining ground on a peace deal. Here for more on this is Brent Sadler, a former Navy officer and research fellow for Naval Warfare at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you for your time, Brent. In terms of the prospect of a diplomatic end to the war, are things different now from when President Trump took office?
Absolutely. I mean, clearly, the last few months, you've seen a very forceful president willing to use the full might of the U.S. National power, use it against Iran when he bombed their nuclear program, setting it back for a very long period of time. The current use of military against the drug cartels. If nothing else, it sends a clear signal to Moscow that there is new leadership willing to use the full might of the United States. And of course, at the same time, a pragmatism that we haven't seen in the past administration regarding trying to find a way to work forward. Things like mineral deals, as well as secondary sanctions on Russia's biggest economic supporters through oil purchases, such as India, and of course, China, who also supports through industrial equipment that had been provided that have a dual use, military as well as civilian use. So clearly, the context has changed in D.C., and I think also, I guess we hope to see a change on the battlefield that might also add additional pressure on Moscow to finally agree to a ceasefire. Very interesting, Brent. In regards to what you're saying about President Trump being more willing to use military force in certain situations, just to clarify, maybe you're not suggesting that we can see American military intervention in this war in any situation to bring about peace? No, absolutely. That's not the intent. But clearly, the United States is willing to provide weapons such as Tomahawk as well as ERAM in large numbers, and to do so without constraints on Ukraine's use of those weapons. And so a greater sense of risk-taking and probably a deeper understanding of exactly the calculus, strategic calculus in Moscow that's at hand now in Washington, D.C., certainly makes it a lot more risky for Moscow to test this administration. Understood. Now, how are you reading the battlefield? Do recent intense attacks by Russians suggest a lack of desire to end the war, any different from, say, previous phases of this war? Oh, I think it's perhaps on the contrary, an effort to signal to the United States as basically the guarantor who's trying to help force these negotiations forward, that Moscow and the price for Moscow's acquiescence is going to be higher. I think that's how I would read it. Not that they don't want to see a ceasefire deal work. Can you explain a little bit more, just in layman's terms, about the point you're making? Yeah, so both sides, the Ukrainians and the Russians, still have quite a lot of fight left in them. And both want to try to hedge their position or bolster their position so they can get more on the negotiations going forward. For Russia, it's ceding of territory that they can't get easily through the force of arms. And so by launching large missile attacks right now, as the terms of this negotiation are going forward, it makes it more likely, in their mind, Moscow's mind, that the United States might put more pressure on Ukraine to accept things that they otherwise wouldn't, because the threat is that Russia still has a lot more violence left to execute against Ukraine, and it's better to seal the deal now and give up more territory. Ukraine, of course, launched a retaliatory strike, perhaps the largest drone attack on Russia since the beginning of this war, so this actually goes both ways. I see what you're saying. Even though we've seen intense fighting now nearly for 4 years, that Russia may be ramping things up because it could see a diplomatic end in sight and it wants to get the better end of the deal. Understood. Now, who are the stakeholders? It's the whole world, but that can make a difference in bringing about peace. This is the Europeans. Maybe they can exert more pressure along with American efforts. Or is this just too difficult a situation to remedy given the current circumstances? Well, there's a very short list of those that matter in getting a meaningful and enduring peace, certainly getting a ceasefire signed in the near future. For Europe to make the point clear, they don't have much to provide in actual hardware for military or munitions. They do have financial resources they're directing now to buy and to help fund through the United States the munitions that keep the Ukrainians in the fight against Russia. But as far as it comes to the type of military power that's going to compel Moscow to lay down its arms and see that continuing this war is futile, That's the United States. The same is true. The United States is the one with the influence on Kyiv to also apply leverage to see that they also are compelled to agree to a ceasefire that can hopefully lead to a lasting peace. So it's really three parties. The two that are at war, Russia, Ukraine, and the United States, are the ones that matter most in trying to get the ceasefire done.
I see what you mean, Brent. Now, help us understand the who's who. I mean, we know the what's what, where the military regiments are and, so forth, but are the right people in the right places? For example, Ursula von der Leyen, Witkoff. I mean, with the personalities, do they all match up to get that end state?
Well, the most important is the orchestrator behind all this is the President of the United States, and it's clear that he's engaged. It's not been, I guess, a straight path for sure. It's taken a far lot longer time to get to this point. But again, I think the overwhelming part of that equation was both the Ukrainians and the Russians still had an entire fighting season that they wanted to see play out. And that's coming to a close now in the past few weeks. And I think we still have a few more weeks in this window that both sides see as a potential opportune time for a pause. But as far as the United States negotiating side, I think it's important to point out that you've got the Chief of Staff of the Army that's traveled recently with a senior enlisted advisor. This is perhaps partly to deliver messages, but also to take note of what actually is going on in the front line. Whatever happens in the terms of the ceasefire, when the fighting stops and the two armies have to pull away from each other, no less than 20 kilometers from an effective line of control, to be clear, because of the nature of warfare with drones, it also must be one in which the front line is defensible in a manner that if the Ukrainians, or more likely the Russians, decide they want to reinitiate hostilities, doing so would come with such a risk and such a cost that it makes it very unlikely and improbable. So the devil is in the details. Having those with very deep military operational understanding, in this case, land battles, is a good thing to see in the recent trips to Kyiv by the Chief of Staff of the Army, his senior enlisted advisor. And we also know that the Secretary of the Army has also traveled recently and is engaging more directly with the Russians.
So interesting, that deep analysis that you bring to the table. And yeah, like you said, the chief negotiator, President Trump, I mean, the presidency, it says it adds 2 years for every 1 year onto your life. It's a lot of work. That New York Times article saying he's slowing down, but he's saying he's worked harder than he ever has. This is certainly a big task that is on his plate. Now, what are you watching for next? How can we get a glimpse of progress on a peace deal, given that the Russians have rejected earlier offers, basically saying they include provisions that are deal breakers?
Yeah, I mean, I caution against getting too engaged in the sausage making of the details and the leaking that's going on. That's being done with a strategic purpose to try to shape the negotiations that no one should be seeing on the outside. So for me, I'll be watching to see if there's a comment of the President of the United States before the end of the Thanksgiving holidays, signaling that he's willing to meet with Zelensky and or Putin. That'll be an indication that there is a ceasefire agreement that has a high probability of being signed by both Ukraine and Russia. Of course, the other thing I'll be watching for is the details, and it's too absent in so far, even in the leaked conversations, is what will be the disposition of forces in the Black Sea through this ceasefire as well. In the previous drafts that have been leaked, there's been no comment on that. That is a necessary place to address, because without easy access to the global markets through the Black Sea, Ukraine's economy will always be under threat from Moscow.
Leaks upon leaks, all in this big mix. We'll have to see exactly how this plays out. Brent Sadler, thanks for coming on and sharing your insight with us.
Thank you, and have a good Thanksgiving.